what turned into a fairly lengthy paper on the broken concepts that prevent any real understanding of monetary economics. And my marketing team decided to schedule it and then sort of dribble it out one anti-concept at a time. So it'll be a dozen articles or so. I think the first two or three have come out so far. So it's fortuitous that you guys were talking about anti-concepts, because that's really the key to my whole talk. So I was going to start out by saying, how many of you think that definitions are arbitrary or social constructs? That the proper definition of a word is whatever is most commonly accepted as the definition for something. Is that a belief that prevails here? Nobody raising it? Good, because that's the first obstacle to get over, is when they, and I'm going to use that word now in just a vague sense, control the definitions of everything that matters, then that's a recipe for the government to take over all aspects and become a totalitarian regime. That was kind of Orwell's point, wasn't it? That you can't let them control the language, if they control the language, that control you. It was also Ayn Rand's point in Anthem, or one of the points in Anthem. You couldn't even say the word I in that society. We are hungry, but we have eaten. How do you even express, well, you ate, but I didn't, in that kind of a collectivist society? And so, Joel, a little bit deeper, a proper concept is a mental integration that unites an innumerable count of different instances by their common essential and by omitting the measurements. This is Ayn Rand's unique contribution to philosophy, solving a problem that was at least 2,000 or 3,000 years old. How do you know what the essential is, and so forth. But just starting with that, defined in terms of its essential characteristic, and she talks about what if you're defined by some non-essential characteristic? Well, that would allow the perpetrator of this pernicious idea to smuggle something in and get you to think of two essentially different things as if they were the same thing. So the topic came up a little bit earlier talking with Leo. Is it exploitative if you go to some Pacific island where they're living not even in the Stone Age but the Wood Age, and you offer to pay them a can of mushy peas for a day's worth of labor or something? Obviously that can would be more than that person would ever be able to get, but a can is pretty cheap. If you go to the local Tesco, is that exploitative? And so I was joking when I said I think that somebody should add to the Devil's Dictionary by Ambrose Bierce a definition of exploitation as when somebody works for terms that I would not accept. Very subjective. So imagine now if you define employment as an exploitive, unjust relationship, a power relationship. And think of every term the Marxists and the critical thinkers, critical theorists, the social justice warriors, every term that they would use, the white patriarchy, the power structure, et cetera, to portray this as a lopsided, well, yeah, you say it's in the worker's interest, but it's not as if the worker has any real choice. And so employment is an exploitive, almost a wage slavery. Imagine if you define it that way. Now, if you assert openly the proposition that all trade or all interaction between people is necessarily win-lose, well, it's possible to then examine that and say, well, that's not true. The proposition is false. But if you define employment that way, you've smuggled it in, because you're just simply saying, well, this is the definition of employment. And if anybody argues or anybody questions it, you can point to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which occurred, 100 and something years ago in the United States, where they locked the doors to keep the workers in, and then it broke out, and 100 and some odd workers died in the fire, and I imagine a lot more were injured. And you can point to cases where gangs are capturing kids and putting them into prostitution and all these things. You can certainly find examples, slavery, either ancient or modern, and how do you, if you're trying to argue that employment is not exploitative, how do you argue against this? I mean, the things that the socialists bring up are true. These things do exist, they do occur. You have to argue that the definition that he's given of employment is not only wrong, but wrongful. It's not merely mistaken on a matter of fact, it is wrongfully created because it is an attempt to unite two essentially dissimilar things, which is a mutually win-win relationship where you're paying the other party something and the other party is doing work for you, with a win-lose relationship where you're using initiating the use of physical force to coerce somebody into working for you who wouldn't otherwise either work for you or certainly not on those terms. And those are essentially different things. You're uniting them together because you've coined this word, which is unnecessary and rationally unusable. Ayn Rand makes that point. A rationally unusable term if employment were defined that way. So it's very difficult to argue against it. Obviously, in the heat of the moment, people are shouting, angry crowds and whatever. It's not really possible to get to a more philosophical point. This is exploitation, blah, 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 blah. And companies have to be forced to give a raise. If you examine the proposition that minimum wage laws hurt workers, it's pretty easy to see economically that's true. But if you define employment as exploitation, that all gets drowned. And so Ayn Rand uses the term obliterate. An anti-concept obliterates proper conceptual thinking. It wipes out, it actually attacks the mind and you have a blind spot, because to the extent that you have an anti-concept or one or more anti-concepts, there's a cognitive blind spot that you cannot actually see or grasp certain things. And if you argue with socialists about minimum wage, it's clear they flip from it's going to help the workers, and when you show them that it's going to lead to layoffs, they immediately turn into, first of all, ad hominem and envy. Well, you're just obviously a shill for the capitalist class, and if your business can't afford to pay a living wage, well, what the hell is a living wage? It's whatever I say is a living wage. It deserves to go out of business, and then that's the envy side of socialism comes out in full sneer, mode, because of this cognitive blind spot. They can't get it because they're just seeing it as exploitative. Every article, the Wall Street Journal, I think on Friday had an article about United Parcel Service. Do they have that with the brown trucks delivering packages here? UPS. Warned on profits are going to be a lot lower, and costs are up, and wages are up, and they're really going to struggle to make a profit. They may lose money. And if you look at the comments under that thread on Facebook, it's socialist after socialist after socialist say, good, they're cheering that UPS can't make any money. And good for the workers. And it's like, do you not understand where the wage for the workers comes from? Oh, and then the investors, all they do is just park their capital. They're not doing anything useful. Well, where do you think that wage comes from? Somebody had to buy all those trucks and all those buildings and all those airplanes and all those computer systems and build those management systems. And that took a lot of capital. There's tens of billions of dollars, I guess, hundreds of billions of dollars invested in UPS, in capital. So anyways, this is what an anti-concept does. It's pernicious, it's insidious. It wipes out the ability to think of something properly and replaces it with, at best, the best possible case. And I used in my article the example, if you talk to a really young child, a 3 or 4 year old toddler, now it helped back when I was that age. The TVs, the TV you had in your living room was a box of pretty substantial dimensions. It was a meter wide and half a meter deep and whatever, and the screen was only this big, but the box that it was in was massive because of the picture tube. Today they're this thin, so it'd be a little harder to believe this, but it was a fairly common belief amongst 2-year-olds that there are little people in the TV. And, you can kind of say, okay, it's naive, right? And for a 2-year-old, that isn't necessarily that harmful a belief. Sort of serves as a surrogate for the real understanding. But when adults have that kind of level of grasp of things, and I'll talk about a particular anti-concept today that I think falls into that category of little people in the TV. When adults are thinking that way, then at best what you have is an approximate understanding. Or for that matter, the average high school student probably believes that mass and weight are the same thing. Right? You say, what's mass? Well, it's how much something weighs. If you study even introduction to science, you realize that mass and weight are not the same thing. They're quite different, because if you go into outer space, weight is zero, but the mass is still real. These are approximate understandings. What did Ayn Rand say? Does anybody remember the quote about an approximate understanding? It's basically deadly in the realm of cognition, because it fools you into thinking of an understanding when you're throwing around, more or less arbitrary symbols. You don't know what the reference are, you don't know what it really means, and therefore you can take it off in some ridiculous direction and end up with some preposterous conclusion as a result of that. That's pretty much the mess that we have in the field of understanding money today, is everything of just that and more. The understanding that we have is kind of at the level of medieval, and I use this term very deliberately. Before Galileo, they thought that they thought two things that are kind of interesting, and this comes up in the lecture series that Peikoff gives, Induction in Philosophy and Physics. One was they thought if you throw a rock, the rock will go straight until it runs out of force, and then it will go straight down. And that's simply the unwillingness to go out and observe. Right? If you went into a farm field and said, boy, throw a rock, you would see that this is what it does. That's an arch. In fact, archery is named because arrows follow an arc and not a straight line, and do that. They defined speed as the degree of motion. And that's one of those things, now that's not that's wrong, but it's not wrongful. Because for a child or a non-scientist maybe even, that's almost good enough. For anybody who's attempting to study science, you can't do any science with that definition. You can't go anywhere. What degree? What is degree of what? What degree of motion? Okay, but what is motion? It's almost in a way, it's question begging. Okay, so speed of motion is degree of motion. Okay, so speed and degree are essentially synonyms now, but what does that really mean? Galileo said speed or velocity is change in distance per unit of time, meters per second, the speed or velocity. Once you have that, the entire field of physics is born. You couldn't do physics with degree of motion. There's no way to calculate it, there's no way to measure it, there's nothing to do, no way to understand it. Okay, this has greater degree than that. Degree of what? Meters per second. And then everything else is enabled from there. So, with all of that said as background, how do we define money today? Well, there's a lot of different pieces of rubbish that are offered out there, that it's store of value. I'll get to that as a separate anti-concept. But most people, and certainly professors emeritus of monetary economics, even of the nominally free market type, I'm not gonna even say what the Keynesians are necessarily pushing. But I guess I'll take that back. This is one of those areas where the Fed's literal apologists, the court economists that are on the payroll of the Fed, and the most strident people who argue most aggressively against the Fed agree. I mean, where do you see that? The capitalists and the socialists agree on the most basic precepts in money. Everywhere in money, you'll see they agree. If the Fed prints more money, then the prices will go up. And whether you're a Fed court economist, as I call them, or whether you're the most, ardent or rabid free market opposer of the Fed, everybody agrees on these basic precepts. And they're not even wrong. I use that term long before Ayn Rand coined the term the arbitrary. Was a physicist named Wolfgang Pauli. And somebody apparently gave Wolfgang a paper to read, and he looked at it for a moment, and he said, crumples it up, throws it in the bin, and says, this isn't even wrong. And that he understood arbitrary in his own terms, and there's no question in my mind. So how do we define money? The generally accepted medium of exchange. That's what most people would say is money, which means we're conceding to the government the definition. That money is whatever rubbish they force us to use in daily payments that control the definition, which we agreed earlier isn't rightful. It's not correct to say the definition is whatever the government tells you it is. The whole novel of Anthem, if not We the Living, was about the wrongfulness of that, if not Animal Farm. I mean, there's been other books about this theme as well. And people concede, and not for something unimportant, but for one of the most important things, if not the most important thing in the economy, which is money, because money affects everything else in the economy. For that one thing, the definition is, well, whatever they force us to do. One can't help but think of Goethe, who says, none are so hopelessly enslaved as those who falsely believe that they are free. At an epistemological level, we've accepted the government's propaganda, and we try to build our entire understanding of what is money and monetary economics based on this rubbish, whatever the hell circulates. So if you look historically for a moment at this, there was a time a few hundred years ago when there was no question that money meant gold, or arguably gold and silver. And you deposited your money in the bank and had the right to get your money back, and there was a piece of paper evidencing that right, and that piece of paper was a banknote. Nobody at that time confused the banknote, which is the promise to redeem that money or pay that money, with the money itself. Those were two entirely distinct things. Ironically, after a certain point, by degrees, but let's call it 1913, as the powers prepared for war, they took away the right to get your money back, and now the banknote is supposed to stand for nothing but itself. Ironically, the moment they do that, it becomes easier to make the confusion of the banknote with the gold, because the banknote isn't redeemable for anything, so therefore the banknote is the money. And this is what everybody from Larry White to the most ardent Keynesian to Milton Friedman, to everybody would all agree that, yeah, that's the money, because it's a generally recognized, or generally accepted medium of exchange. Okay, is that really so? Okay, let's look at this now. A proper definition is given by what, according to objectivist epistemology? There are two things to make a definition. Can anybody say what those two factors are to make a proper definition?
Genus differential.
Genus and differentia. If money is the generally accepted medium of exchange, what's the genus and what's the differentia? It kind of falls apart. It kind of turns to mush at that point, doesn't it? I mean, is the genus media and the differentia is media of exchange, and now we're trying to say that money is like other media, like social media and broadcast media and print media and media of exchange? Is that really a genus? What the hell is it exactly? Or is it the genus medium of exchange? Are there lots of different media of exchanges, and this one is the more accepted media of exchanges? Well, no. None of that makes any sense. There isn't even a genus differentia there. They're trying to attempt to reverse cause and effect by telling you, well, this is a function, and of course there are other functions, that money can serve, and so we'll define it by its function. So a car is a thing that gets you from Piccadilly to Lehman Street. That's the definition of a car, right? Well, wait a minute. No, because the underground can get you from Piccadilly to Lehman Street. And so can a bus. So could a helicopter if you had one. So could a really big slingshot, I suppose, if you were brave and put on a crash helmet. So you're defining it by its one of its intended functions. That completely falls apart. Note now that what they are doing with this is uniting essentially dissimilar things. There's the gold coin. There's the honest bank issuing an honest, redeemable note that is where the bank is managed in a sound and honest way, and they can actually return that gold to you when you demand it. And then there's, we'll just say, central banks today, without saying what degree of honesty that the Bank of England and the Fed may or may not possess today. Those three things are united as if they were a common essential, as if those were the same three things. And I argue that, of course, the causes and effects of whether you're talking gold mine, whether you're talking the creation of honest gold credit and the issuance of quantitative easing have different causes, different mechanisms, and different effects. They're not in any way the same at all. in the same way that getting run over by that car is not the same thing as waiting on the platform for the next train to show up. They're not even remotely the same. So what have we done? We've defined something by non-essentials because the government has forced us to do so, and we like it. That's where we're at with money. So, how the hell would I define money? I think, and this is going back to Paul Weiner, I don't get credit for this definition, money is the most marketable commodity. The Genesis commodity, a physical thing that you can hold in your hand and take home. Why is that important? Because we're physical beings who live in a physical world. And there's a time, not everybody and not every day, but there's a time when nothing but taking your physical marbles home from the sandbox will do. If you don't like the risk in the banking system, if you don't like the interest rate on offer, if you don't like the geopolitical climate, whatever it may be, the fiscal policy of your government, there's a time for taking your marbles home. And it has to be a physical good, because only a physical good can be taken home. Any piece of paper or electronic credit, you're still captive in the system. Note that this also has a number of interesting and very, very important economic effects. What happens if the local supermarket decides that they're going to charge 300 quid per 100 grams of steak? What would happen in that case? How does the market address the arrogance or stupidity of a grocery store attempting to do this? Nobody would buy. The fact of no one buying means, of course, the steak is perishable. You have to sell it by the end of the week, right, or it goes bad. So they're going to be forced to mark it down to find whatever the consumer is willing to pay for that. In the case of money, there's an analogous situation is what would happen in a gold standard where people can take their money out of the bank if the bank offered too little interest. It isn't worth it. I'll take my money out. And so that is a very important check. That sets the floor into the rate of interest in a free market. Of course, when everybody is forced to be creditors, then they've disenfranchised the saver, and that there is no mechanism anymore, and that's why the interest rate can go zero or go negative in paper currency, as it was recently, and I argue as it will be again all too soon. So there are meaningful differences between gold as money and government credit as if it were money. So the genus is commodity. It has to be a physical thing. Now the differentia is most marketable. What does that mean? Anybody have an idea what marketability means in economic context?
It means you can buy and sell without moving the price, liquidity.
Well, buy and sell without taking a loss or with the least loss. So if you buy, you pay the offer price. When you sell, you take the bid price. And then every different commodity has a different spread between bid and offer. The most marketable one is the one with the least spread, which is the least loss. If you're using money as an indirect medium of trade, I'm selling fish, I want to buy leather shoes, I have to sell the fish and get something, and then I have to take that something to the shoemaker. Money is the thing that offers the least losses. So if I were to attempt to use salt, for example, salt was pretty marketable back in the day, but not as marketable as gold. So when people discovered gold, then they evolve, and over time it becomes winner take all. So you think about today, what's the most valuable commodity? A lot of people would say crude oil, especially given the geopolitical environment we're in right now. But think about this for a minute. Crude oil is smelly, it's toxic, it's highly flammable, it's perishable if it's exposed to sunlight or oxygen, and it's also volatile. On top of that, to buy a decent new car would require approximately a swimming pool filled with oil. So imagine, trying to get paid in oil for any significant amount of value, of economic value. It's just extremely impractical. And of course, governments regulate, where oil can be stored because, oil tanks are subject to explosion. You wouldn't want an oil tank right in the middle of the city of London, for example. If it blew up, it would take out, the world's financial structure. You want those things in remote, isolated places, and so on. So oil is hard to deal in if you're talking the physical stuff. I mean, anybody can go to a screen today and trade oil futures or oil derivatives. But as a commodity, something that you'd want to take home, you really wouldn't want an oil truck or a convoy of oil, tankers backing up to your house. Sir, where would you like us to dump this oil on your front lawn? Isn't very practical. The same amount of value, if it were gold, solid gold, it'd be about this big. You stick it in your pocket and walk down the street. This would be a couple of kilos of gold. So it'd be, your pants would be kind of dragging on one side, but wear a belt. But you could easily do it. The point being that this is why gold is more marketable. I can talk about gold's marginal utility. There's a lot of things I can talk about that are kind of outside the scope of today's talk. But for purposes of this, the money is the most marketable good, and gold is the most marketable of all the goods. By far. I mean, nothing else comes remotely close except silver, and that's pretty remote. The same value in silver. Silver is about 80 to 1 ratio in terms of mass to have the same value, and silver is about half of the density of gold. So it would take about 160 times the bulk in silver versus gold to have the same value. So imagine 160 of these cell phones, be a block this big, and and weigh, instead of 2 kilos, 160 kilos. Obviously, that's not something you're going to put in your pocket or even in a backpack. A little bit too much for that. So, is everybody clear why money is the most marketable good? It gives control to, or the saver who owns it is the one who's in control, not the government and their paper issuance.
I understand the definition, but why is silver? Is it an accident that gold is more valuable than silver? Because you can imagine the price of silver being higher than gold.
No, it's not an accident, but I think the explanation for that is way outside the scope of what I really want to talk about today. Is as kind of all these anti-concepts related to money and how everything neatly leads to supporting this Keynesian, which is socialist, scheme that they're running. Matthew.
Just to make a point, if you look at a Bank of England currency now, whether it's £5, £10, £20, whatever, there's a tiny little print on it that says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of whatever denomination the note is. And the point of that used to be that you could take it into the bank and exchange it for the amount in gold. And now, these days, and it's long been the case, there's nowhere near enough gold in the Bank of England's vaults to cover the notes that are...
Well, they wouldn't redeem it anyway. I mean, that's a vestige. Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because in the U.S. they used to say this is payable and lawful money, right? And now it just says this is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Sure. So they actually changed the text on the note to not even bother saying that anymore.
Yeah, and don't even pretend. Yeah.
And your note still has that on there, but of course no bank would even understand the request, let alone honor it. I mean, it's a credit relationship where the fine print says the credit will never be honored. Yeah. Imagine a contract that says this won't be honored. What the hell's the point of the contract? So everyone gets all wrapped around the axle of this is money and what does it mean and so on and so forth. And the root of it is a conceptual sleight of hand in how they foist this off as if it were money, rather than the proper term for that is irredeemable credit. It is a credit. You are lending to the Bank of England, who on lends to the Exchequer and the banking system. And you are to treat that as if that were money, except it doesn't serve some of the functions of money, including the ability to let you opt out, which is what a commodity would enable. Wikipedia defines money. Money is any item or verifiable record that is generally accepted as a payment of goods. So even in the very definition, it's any item or verifiable record. It is deliberately in the definition. They are being open, overt, in saying that the coat that you check at the restaurant and the coat check, the piece of paper they give you, are both defined as the same thing. The coat and the coat check are the same thing. They're that bold. Let's talk about inflation. How would most people define inflation?
General prices.
Rise in general prices.
That's kind of the lay definition. And then what would the pedantic Milton Friedman type offer as that, quibble?
Too much money chasing too few goods.
They would say it's an increase in the quantity of money relative to. So I have a quote from Milton Friedman in here, in which he says, I want to get the exact quote. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. So here's a guy who absolutely was clear that the monetarists define inflation as an increase in quantity of money, is now saying inflation is an increase in prices caused by an increase in money. Now, where in the world would you find any other scientist who would go way out of his way to distinguish between two things and then go and use them as if they're the same thing? It's very bizarre, and the level of cognitive impairment when it comes to money just has no bounds. Now, of course, the way the monetarists view things is an increase in the quantity of money necessarily and always causes an increase in prices. And because they believe that, because that is an article of faith, then they can treat the two things as if they're the same. So inflation is either an increase in prices or an increase in the quantity, which causes an increase in prices. So it's all good to just freely conflate one with the other and literally migrate back and forth and equivocate at will, because they're the same, or at least one is the cause and the other is the effect. And of course, we know in proper philosophy, one always can conflate we can't conflate cause and effect. We need to be clear that the cause is the cause and the effect is the effect. So even if that were true, that would be wrongful of them to define it that way. And here's Milton Friedman, the godfather of everything that passes for sound money understanding today, making that mistake. Now, I want to talk about this idea, and I think somebody here said this, and Milton Friedman is quite deliberate in saying a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than in output. So he's comparing an increase in quantity of money with, or money supply, as people would call it, versus the increase in goods supply. And I want to deliberately use the word supply to refer to both of those, so I can show why it's wrongful to use the same word in both cases. How many of you have a science background? Take an engineering or science. The thing you get in often in high school in America, or certainly your first university class in science, and they're very persnickety about it. It's called dimensional analysis. Does that ring a bell? If something's an equation, the dimensions on both sides must be the same. And if they're not the same, it's telling you made a very elementary mistake. And by elementary mistake, I mean the kind of mistake that would cause a freshman to fail a test if you made this kind of mistake. So, 18-year-olds at their first level of university are expected to know better. And the entire field of monetary science is making this video. Everybody familiar with F equals ma, even if you're not studying science? So F is force equals mass times acceleration. By what I just said about dimensional analysis, force, whatever force is, has to equal mass times acceleration. Well, mass is kilograms. Acceleration is meters per second per second. So velocity is meters per second. Acceleration is change in velocity. So it's meters per second changing at a rate of, so it's meters per second per second. So force in any system has to be mass times acceleration. In this case, kilogram meters per second must be the definition of the unit of force, and in the metric system, that unit is newtons. And Newton is a kilogram meter per second. And the deeper you study it, you realize, yes, that's true, number one, and two, this is why. So in any real science, you have to pay attention to the units. And so in my paper, I talk about Boyle's law, PV equals nRT, pressure times volume equals a constant times the number of moles of the gas times the temperature. The monetarists have their pseudo equation MV equals PQ, which sort of sounds a lot like that, and yet they don't pay attention even to the basic dimensional analysis, even to the units. They fail even at the most basic level. That, as I said, in real science, a freshman would fail for not understanding this. This is like foundational. You can't do science if you're sloppy about your units. Any science lecturer or science professor is going to say, what's the units on that? What did you do here? How did you mess that up? And then they won't let you go on. I mean, no further discussion until you get the units right. So what is money so-called supply? And going back to the gold standard, just to make things conceptually clearer, money supply is a quantity. It's a stocks. So it would be tons. There's X number of tons of gold in human hands at any given moment in time. What's a goods supply? It's a flows. It is a rate of goods production per month or per year. Well, the UK produces this many tons of wheat per year. Saudi Arabia produces this many tons, maybe barrels of oil per year. Russia produces this many tons or maybe cubic meters of natural gas per year. So it is a quantity divided by a time. It's rather like velocity. And money is a stocks rather like distance. So that's like comparing the distance of your house to here. That's a distance relative to the velocity of the underground train that I took getting here. You can't compare distance to velocity. They're incomparable. So it is utterly, what Milton Friedman said is literally arbitrary. As money supply is increasing, so an increase in money supply would be tons per year. He's comparing that to relative to the increase in output. So output is tons per year already. He's now comparing tons per year of gold to tons per year, which is change in goods output. He's comparing velocity to acceleration. He's literally made a mistake that would fail any freshman in any science class or any engineering class. Not even wrong, as Wolfgang Pauli would say. So, what is inflation? If it isn't an increase in quantity of... So, also getting back to that same thing I was saying earlier, is a gold coin the same thing as an honest gold redeemable note issued by an honest bank? Is that the same thing as the redeemable credit that's pumped out like affluent by the central banks in their so-called quantitative easing? Are those three things the same? No, of course not. And so therefore one would not expect that they would have the same causes, one would not expect to have the same effects. What is inflation? And then here's an interesting question. And I think Ayn Rand said there's no such thing as inflation in gold. And she may not have said that. And maybe Greenspan said that. I'm not sure where. I think I read that many years ago before I studied economics. There are people today who are so dogmatic about the definition of inflation as being an increase in the quantity of money that they would say gold mining is inflation. Certainly the Bitcoin is. Probably, there must be an exception somewhere, but I haven't met one. I would say every last Bitcoiner holds that gold mining is inflation. Bizarre. Gold mining is inflation? You look at what the Fed is doing today and you look what a gold miner does and you think that the same word applies to both? Well, because of this paradigm creates these cognitive blind spots that can't get it. What is inflation, properly defined? So far as I know, I'm the one who developed this. Ayn Rand gets on this without actually naming it specifically, and I think it was inflation and egalitarianism. When she talks about, they're giving you this paper that your own future work is going to have to make good on, or something like that. I forget how she put it. It was very eloquent. I define inflation as the counterfeiting of credit. It's not about the quantity of it, it's about the dishonesty of it. So proper credit has 4 elements. Number 1, the lender knows that he's lending. Number 2, the lender agrees to lend under the terms. Number 3, the borrower has the means to repay. That is, he's financing a productive asset of some sort. And number 4, the borrower has intention to repay. If one or more of those elements is missing, and of course today with what the central banks are doing, all 4 elements are missing, because what they produce, that effluent that they emit, is deemed to be defined to be money, then people don't think that in terms of their borrowing. I think that everyone would argue they're printing. I'm probably the only economist saying it's not printing, it's borrowing, to the point where I feel like I'm pedantic and risking just pissing off everybody in the room by saying it's not printing, it's borrowing. It's counterfeiting, because they have neither the means nor the intent to repay. They can't. They can't even balance the budget, let alone repay anything. They go deeper and deeper and deeper into debt until some great crisis will erupt, which we haven't arrived at yet. That is what inflation is. And then deflation is a forcible contraction in credit. And so sometimes it's a default, other times there's cram downs or swaps of debt for equity. There's a lot of different ways that courts and creditors and debtors will resolve these things. It isn't always just an outright default. But the point is it's an involuntary, the creditor wouldn't really agree to it, except he looks at the borrowing, the condition of the borrower and says, well, this is the best I'm going to get, right? I mean, there's a business here, and now I have the equity of it rather than the debt. Hopefully I'll recoup my losses eventually that way.
So how do you call the increase in prices?
It's an increase in prices. And, which is really, really important, because there are many, 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 many non-monetary causes of an increase in prices. If you have the cognitive blind spots we're talking about here, Friedman is saying inflation is always and everywhere monetary. It can only be produced by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Well, in the UK, they passed two stupid laws around 2017. And by stupid, I mean evil and irrational. The first was to prohibit domestic fracking for natural gas. So natural gas has to be imported, because that's how natural gas is produced, is by fracking. It's illegal. Number two, they forced power plants and heavy industry to switch from oil and coal to burning natural gas. So it now has to be imported. That drives up the cost of energy domestically by quite a lot. It's not a small change. And that forces up the cost of everything that depends on energy, either in its manufacture or its distribution. Can you point to anything in this room that didn't require energy to be produced or distributed? Everything depends on energy. They forced up the cost of energy massively. Then enter the COVID lockdown. So remember, the UK has to import its energy, because all energy has to be imported because you can't produce it domestically. And now you get to the COVID lockdown, they can no longer ship Christmas tree ornaments from a factory in China to the port in LA, let alone natural gas. So suddenly the price of natural gas spikes 15 times. This is already the post-increase due to those two stupid laws. That was like 2017. In 2020 or 2021, price of natural gas goes up 15x. It's so expensive, in fact, that fertilizer plants shut down. So fertilizer is produced by natural gas. Shut down the fertilizer production, which means the price of fertilizer is going to skyrocket. Guess what that's going to hit? The farmers and food. Massive, massive, massive increases in prices. That has nothing whatsoever to do with the monetary system. They literally made food scarcer and therefore more expensive. And so another problem, this is, I guess you'd call it a package deal in defining inflation as a rise in prices, is that it conflates two different phenomena with the same word, which is a monetary phenomenon. Now the monetary system can cause rising prices, although it's nowhere near the simple linear relationship that everybody presumes. My theory of interest and prices is a whole nother lecture. That's not today. It isn't a simple linear assumption that people make. But it can cause prices to rise with non-monetary phenomena, which I call, the term I coined for that is useless ingredients. So I don't know in the UK if the petrol companies are forced to put ethanol or MBTE in the fuel. I don't know what the regulations are here. But in the United States, in the summer months, they have to put an oxidizer in the gasoline. And for a long time, that was ethanol, and now it's MBT, or the other way around, I don't know. And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, here's something that they're forced to put in, which adds cost. That adds at least 25 cents a gallon in cost. And at the time that I was thinking about this, gas was $2 or $3 a gallon. So this is a 10% additional cost for something that the average person may not even be aware is in there. And even if they are aware, and of course every gas pump in the United States has a sticker telling you this, So most people probably would be aware, unlike most cases where this is occurring. And the average consumer does not value having MBTE in their gas. Nobody would ask for that by name. Nobody would say, oh, I don't want to buy this gas. It doesn't have the MBTE in it. I want this gas. In fact, it actually gives you worse fuel economy and lowers your horsepower slightly. It's actually a detriment. So I coined the term useless ingredient for things that regulators force companies to add. You know, today if you buy a new car, it has like 17 airbags in it. How many of those airbags does anybody actually care about? Not 17 of them. And it has catalytic converters, and it has oxygen sensors, all kinds of crap in there that add cost to the car, considerable cost, but that are useless ingredients. And so I object on the strongest possible terms cognitively to the error of lumping useless ingredients, and also taxes. So if the government comes along and says, we're going to increase the GST for restaurants by 10%, and you come and eat here tomorrow, they'd reprint the menus and everything would be 10% higher. It isn't inflation, or it isn't a monetary phenomenon anyways. There's other problems in Milton Friedman's theory, which I can't get to, but as to why that actually works that way, and Friedman would quibble it couldn't, because the money supply didn't increase. So he'd be arguing against reality. I want to get to, and I realize I've been talking for a long time, there's at least one other that's very interesting to talk about, and that is, let me talk about investment. It's also very interesting. An investment is an asset, this is from Investopedia. Quote, an investment is an asset or item acquired with the goal of generating income or appreciation, unquote. Can anybody spot, at least at a superficial level, what they've done in this definition? Yet again.
Can you repeat the definition, sorry?
An asset or item acquired with the goal of generating income or appreciation. And in my emphasis, I just gave it away with the word or. This thing is defined by this or this other thing which is superficially similar but actually different. Income or appreciation. So an investment is, I buy a farm to operate the farm and generate income by producing and growing and selling food, or I buy Bitcoin so that it will go up. Those are conflated under the same word. Magic. Are those the same things? So what it's doing is it's conflating investment with speculation. And investment is when you're financing the production of something, and the profit to the investor comes from the increase in production that you've enabled with your investment. So, financing a farm, a factory, a ship, a truck, a warehouse, a manufacturer, even a designer designs something and then they contract out the manufacturing. Value is being created and the investor gets some of the value and the entrepreneur gets some of the value. What is speculation? You buy this thing, it goes up, you sell it to the next guy who's also a speculator. Very different. Where's the profit come from in speculation? It comes from the next guy. So people would say, well, it's a greater fool theory, and then, money can be lost if you run out of greater fools, which is sort of true, again, in the same way that saying that there's little people on the TV is sort of true. The value is actually being created, and I'm probably the only one arguing this, the value is actually being destroyed all the way up. Not when the price crashes, but all the way up. Because at each instance, you fork over $1,000 dollars to buy that Bitcoin, you're giving your savings to the previous guy who's getting out. And what is he going to do with that? Well, let's say he bought it at 500, so he's going to take his $500 worth of capital back, and then 500 is a profit. What do people do with their profit? Well, they spend it. He's spending your life savings, which you willingly forked over to him. Why? Because you think you're going to get your money back, and then some. It's actually not getting your money back. It's you think the next speculator is going to fork over $2,000 of his life savings. You'll take your $1,000 out and then spend $1,000 as your profit. And he's doing it because he thinks the next guy's going to fork over $4,000 of his life savings. So speculation is a conversion I'm going to ask the lawyer in the room, does conversion legally have an overtone of like an illicit taking in the UK? So in the US, this is a statute. If you, I don't know, come and occupy somebody's lawn and have a big party on it and then eventually sort of leave, but, now everything's kind of chewed up or whatever a little bit. It's conversion. You use something you didn't have the right to use. And so I'm using conversion as a double entendre here, that one person's wealth becomes, through this market process, becomes another person's income to be spent on consumer goods. So one of the common themes through all of this, and Keynesianism ultimately, is about how do you stimulate consumption. Consumption is the driver of the economy in this view. Everything's about what you can consume. And I'm going to get to purchasing power in a minute as another example of how they smuggle this pernicious idea. With each time the asset goes up in price, there's a conversion of somebody's wealth into somebody else's income to be consumed. And that's a process with a finite end. I'm not just talking about for that particular asset, but if an entire society is operating that way, eventually, as Margaret Thatcher said, you run out of other people's money, you run out of capital. Ayn Rand, and by the way, Mises talks about eating the seed corn, which is a very clear analogy as to what's going on. What happens when you finish consuming the seed corn?
You run out of corns.
The next winter, you're going to have a very hard time because you won't be able to plant your crop in the spring. Let's talk about, what did I just say a minute ago? Let's talk about GDP. There's a couple of different ways of measuring GDP, but there's the famous equation y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, or GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus exports minus imports. So leaving out the imports versus exports thing, GDP is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures. Does anybody see any problem with this?
Production and destruction.
Yes. They're saying here's this thing that equals production plus destruction, as if they both have the same positive sign. The more destruction is better, the more production is better. Is that not pernicious or what? So if you listen to the George Selgins of the world, and these guys are free market guys. George Selgin was invited to speak at Ayn Rand's OCON twice. And he will talk about, he'll quibble or demur and say, well, there's good growth and bad growth, and if growth is too much, it's bad, and some growth is more efficient than others. It's all this quibbling. It's all of this mealy-mouthed, pap, not even pap, worse, it's poison that comes out to try to obscure that you cannot add production and destruction. That you should want less destruction, all the way to the point of wanting zero destruction, if we could have a rational society where nobody was destroying anything. And you should want more. Yeah, if the government takes your money and then pays some useless moocher to sit and watch TV and do drugs, that's pure destruction. They've taken your capital and given it to somebody who's going to eat it literally and destroy it. You should want none of that. With less of it, the better, and all the way down to zero if you could. And so to add those two things together and say the economy grew. So imagine if the government borrowed more to dole out more welfare, and anybody had the temerity to call that growth. Is that growth? If you max out your credit card and fly to Las Vegas to go on a bender, is that growth? Are you getting richer? How does anybody even think that? Because GDP gives them this cognitive blind spot. And the whole damn thing is about consumption. So there's another one in here, which is the wealth effect. This one particularly ticks me off at economists who use this term. So the wealth effect is a well-observed phenomenon that if people's asset prices are going up, they feel wealthier, they spend more. So the definition of it, I don't know if I'm going to spend the time. People typically, quote, this is from Wikipedia, people typically spend more overall when one of two things is true. People are actually richer, objectively, or people perceive themselves to be richer. For example, the assessed value of their home increases. The wealth effect is deliberately conflated They're actually richer. Now, how do you actually get richer? You have to produce more. What's being perceived to be richer? How do you perceive to be richer? Well, the central bank drives down the interest rates, which drives up asset prices. If asset prices all go up, people perceive that they are richer. Every one of these paths all point back to Rome. All roads lead to Rome, which is how do we get people, how do we overstimulate them to consume more? The final one I want to talk about, and then I'll open it up to Q&A, is purchasing power. Everybody heard this term? What is the purchasing power of your money? And by money, they mean irredeemable credit. Well, this is the term that I started off the talk by saying it's like thinking that there's little people in the TV, and we can see that when a 3-year-old says that, it's kind of cute and kind of funny, and you know he's going to outgrow that because he's going to realize that, no, it's an electronic thing. But people think that there's goods and services in the money. And that's the purchasing power of it. Every time the government prints more, that somehow the amount of goods that are in the money goes down. But as I hinted at earlier, the government can absolutely do lots of things to impair the production of goods, make goods genuinely scarcer and of lower quantity or lower supply. And if that happens, then of course their prices go up by the law of supply and demand. So the price of something isn't in the money. The price is the measure of the exchange rate of the money to the goods, and there's a lot of different forces that can affect that pricing, but the term purchasing power implies that it's in the money. So whenever anybody in America ever says this, and they say the purchasing power of the dollar is half of what it was or whatever, I always try to kind of be a smart ass. And I always say, okay, do you mean the Midtown Manhattan dollar or the Yuma, Arizona dollar? So Yuma, Arizona is a fairly small rural city in Arizona, all the way west near the border with California. If you're driving from Phoenix to San Diego, near the border, you run into the city called Yuma, where let's just say the cost of living is much, much, much lower than Midtown Manhattan. In the same way that if you went up to the Cotswolds or whatever, the cost of living would be a hell of a lot cheaper than trying to be in Mayfair. So is it the Mayfair pound or is it the Cotswolds pound? Well, it's the same currency, right? And the point of that pointed question is to try to illustrate that if there's a difference in prices between the two, obviously it's not the difference in the currency, it's the difference in the prices for some other non-monetary reason. Having to do with supply and demand, obviously it's very expensive to do business in a city like this. I can only imagine getting deliveries at 2 in the morning, paying people double time or more. Restricted road, the cost of delivery must be a fortune here. And if you're in a rural town, a village with a crossroads, basically, then delivery is cheap. And labor is probably cheaper there because there's probably not that many jobs available. So if you want to hire somebody, you probably have a pool of applicants. In London, that may not be so at the moment. I'm not sure. All of these things try to. Purchasing power. That's the other thing. So purchasing power makes a number of errors. The other is getting back to this idea of the farm. Suppose you inherit a farm from your grandfather passes away, and he leaves you a 200-acre farm up somewhere in a rural area where everything's farms. There's 2 basic approaches you can take to that. And one is, we'll call it Business 101. Right? You survey all the lands you have, and you look at the pigs, and you look at the cows, and you look at the sheep, and you look at the cornfields, and you try to optimize how you're going to produce more for less and increase the profits. So the whole point of the farm is to grow food to sell, and that's your income. And the other approach is to sell the farm, is to liquidate the farm. And purchasing power as a notion, I won't use the word concept, but anti-concept. Purchasing power is an anti-concept, encourages you to think of the value of the farm, not in terms of the food that it can grow, but the liquidation value. If you were to trade the farm for groceries, how many groceries would the farm liquidate for? So you're trying to think of productive assets as their liquidation value. Very perverse. That is a very Keynesian, how do we stimulate consumption? And so I always talk about the idea that you sell off the acreage of the farm to some condominium developer. You chop down all the apple trees because cabinets made of fruit wood is very chic, and you rip down the barns because the old barn planks can be machined into flooring, which is very cool. All the places here in central London, if they're posh, will have that kind of flooring. and then you sell the tractor to an artist. And so this actually took this picture in Las Vegas. There's an art dealer that sells this kind of stuff. It's like they've taken the gears and the chains and the cylinder block and whatever, and they make it into some art object, objet d'art, and that's that whole paradigm. So funny but true story. I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Sydney. A couple of years ago, must have been pre-COVID, and unbeknownst to me, there was somebody giving a talk on purchasing power. And it was everything I just debunked as a fallacy. That was his main thesis. That, the government's printing more money, it's not printing, it's borrowing, it's not money, it's credit, and that causes prices to rise, which means the purchasing power is going down, therefore buy gold, right? That was because he sells gold. I didn't realize that was his talk, and I'm not sure I would have done anything differently if I did. My talk was called yield purchasing power, which is a concept I developed, that instead of thinking of the liquidation value of productive assets, you should think of the operating income. So purchasing power is, how many hamburgers can I buy if I sell the farm? Yield purchasing power is, how many hamburgers can I buy on the operating income from my farm? So it's what can I buy with the yield I'm earning versus what can I buy with the liquidation. And of course, yield is perpetual. If it's a farm, every year it produces. Liquidation is once. Ayn Rand doesn't use these terms explicitly, obviously, and Atlas Shrugged was a novel, not an economics treatise. But what is one of the conflicts that sort of comes up between Dagny and Jim several times? It's this idea that a profit is when you take a productive thing and you sell it. And she's like, Jim, what the hell did you do? Did he sell the John Galt line or something like that? What the hell did you do? And he said, you always keep talking about making a profit. Well, I made a profit, didn't I? I sold this. And yeah, but what are you going to do for an encore after that's sold? Well, you've literally given away the farm to get some groceries. So, in conclusion, you've got to define things properly. In a field like monetary economics, and I think this is applicability to any kind of intellectual activism that we as objectivists could ever aspire to. When you come to a field and you really look at it, you have to decide how much of that field has a legitimate foundation. So for instance, if you come to the field of diet and exercise, do you want to throw out everything that's known about biology and biochemistry and start from scratch? Probably not. You probably want to say, well, there's a lot of good here, and here's where they made a mistake, and correct that. But if you come to a field, as I did, which is monetary economics or monetary science, and you look at it and you realize that there might be a few gems here and there, but by and large, it's medieval in its understanding of things. And worse yet, everything is anti-concept after anti-concept after anti-concept. I didn't even go into all the ones I wrote in my paper, and my paper certainly didn't cover all the anti-concepts in this field. And you come to it and you realize that it's very daunting. If you really want to be an activist in this area, you can't say, well, what we need is a Fed or a Bank of England that's better managed. That does not do. That's what Ayn Rand called poison when she read Milton Friedman. It's not about, well, let's advise the Fed on how to manage it better. You really have to say, you know what, this whole field is rubbish, and here's how you're going to properly establish this field on sound footing, which is very daunting, and the entire world looks at you like you're an idiot, of course, or crazy, or both. And you better spend a number of years doing it, and you have to build the entire edifice. I imagine, and I haven't studied a lot of other fields, but there are a lot of other fields that probably have a similar, thing to this, where the terms as they're defined are rationally unusable. The conclusions all point to some propaganda item of the state. In this case, it all points to consumption. Oh, and there's another sleight of hand here. The belief that prices rising is always a matter of inflation of the central bank is the perfect sleight of hand to let the regulators and the taxinators off the hook. No matter what they do, if they force energy to be scarcer and the prices goes up, everybody's blaming who? The central bank. And demanding what? Hike the interest rates. And then what they get is a giant academic discussion with academics on both sides arguing why interest rates need to be higher or lower. And then everyone kind of throws their arms up in despair. It's like, well, there's nothing to be done. This is far too complicated. And meanwhile, the real cause of it is green energy restrictions gets a complete pass. Because it couldn't have been green energy restrictions. Milton Friedman told us it's always and everywhere monetary. Therefore, we're not even looking at green energy restrictions to see why the hell did it get so expensive. To heat and cool anything here. I'll tell you, the airports here, and not just in the UK, but in Europe, they're not air conditioned in the summer anymore. If they are, not by much. It's hot and sweaty walking around an airport, dragging luggage and everything else. Didn't used to be. And in the US it isn't. So they've made everybody poorer, and everyone thinks, oh yeah, it's the central bank, and they'll fix it by hiking interest rates. Well, one thing I can absolutely assure you, hiking interest rates ain't gonna fix it. So this is very, very, very clever propaganda. And I'll leave you with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, who is the only guy that I've called a vicious bastard in a printed article. I actually dropped the F-bomb on him. I said, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to do this. This guy was pure evil. This guy intended to overthrow, as he put it, the capitalist order, the civilization. He intended to overthrow civilization. And he said there's no surer way to overthrow the capitalist order than by debauching the money. And he goes on and on and on. And everybody assumes that he means print more, prices go up. Therefore, the value of the money is 1 over consumer prices. So prices double, the purchasing power of the money is halved, the money is valued half, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what everybody assumes he meant. Which would be pretty stupid, because at the end of his quote, he says, and it does so by engaging all the hidden forces of economics, which today we'd use the word incentives, in a way that not 1 in a million can diagnose how their world is being destroyed. Now he's either stupid or he's brilliant. Because if he meant that you're going to cause prices to go up and not 1 in a million would notice it, I'd call him stupid. Everybody talks about inflation every day nowadays. To say not 1 in a million notices the prices are going up is stupid. Now I remember when monetary forces were driving the prices in the late 1970s. There might be a few people in this room old enough to remember that. It was on the nightly news every day. They called it the misery index, which was unemployment plus inflation. Every day, 5 days a week, there was a discussion of it on the news, and everybody was talking about inflation every day. It was not the case that not 1 in a million can diagnose it. What Keynes was referring to was, and he talks about driving the interest rate to zero, which he justifies on economics ground that capital is very plentiful, it doesn't need a return, blah, 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 blah. He justifies it to euthanize, his term, the rentier, the people who live on investments. And he wants to kill them. And he also talks about overthrowing all the bonds of civil society by destroying the sacred relationship between creditor and debtor. All of these things, he's quite explicit, drive the interest rate to zero. He knew something that his critics failed to grasp, which is you drive the interest rates to zero, you drive asset prices to infinity, because the asset price is the inverse of the interest rates. Driving asset prices to infinity, I think he got this idea of conversion of wealth to income that destroys all the capital in the end. And why is nobody diagnosing it? Because it's an endless fucking bull market. Who could possibly say a bull market's a bad thing? I've had objectivists say, with friends like you, free markets don't need enemies. They think I'm an enemy of a free market because I'm opposing the artificial stimulus of an endless bull market, which is induced by the Fed, which is not capitalism at all. And they misunderstand where I'm coming from. This is a Keynesian idea of driving interest rates to zero, which has been happening over the last 40 years, notwithstanding the current blip. And that this is what destroys everything, ultimately the capitalist order, which means destroying society, which is what Keynes wanted, the vicious bastard. And not 1 in a million can diagnose it because everybody loves the bull market, because everyone is getting rich, or, which is equivalent according to the very definition states, it is equivalent to either be objectively getting richer or that you feel you're getting richer. So subjectivism, moral relativism, right there in the very definition. It doesn't matter whether you're getting richer or not. You feel richer, and that's good enough. Go consume, spend more. And that's the whole bloody point of Keynesianism. People vote to re-elect the politicians in office because they feel the economy is good. With that, I end. If anybody dares have any questions.